Marvel does not understand how the multiverse works.
The MCU is also accidentally breaking its own movies.
Trying to fit them into the same multiverse doesn't work.
I believe the multiverse, as used in such films, is ultimately just a gimmicky plot device born out of creative fatigue and filmmakers running out of new ideas.
I've always had a problem with ripping my pants. Having a big ass has always been a blessing and a curse. So one day, I'm working at a suit shop, dressed in some fancy-ass clothes to look the part, and it's time to grab some suits from the tailor 10 blocks away. So through the heart of New York City I went, and as I walked back with many a suits in hand, they began slipping out of their bags. Then the bags slipped out of my hands too. Basically, everything started falling to the floor, and the biggest thought in my little worker bee mind was, I have to save these suits. So, with no hesitation, I bent over fast as ever and... No way, I whispered to myself. I reached my hand to the spot in question, and not only did my pants completely rip in half from front to back, but my underwear underneath had also been ripped from a previous incident a few years ago. Yeah, let's just say I was overdue for laundry day. So I was standing there, bent over, frozen, flashing the entire Upper East Side of Manhattan with literally everything hanging out. And I realized in that moment that I was living in the worst possible timeline. Oh, and I still had 8 blocks to go. Perhaps somewhere out there in the multiverse, I was born with a slightly smaller ass. Or maybe a world exists where pants are made stronger and more flexible. Or maybe I had at least done my laundry. The possibilities that could have changed this outcome are endless, as is the concept of the multiverse. You know, one little thing, or maybe even a bunch of major things that could have gone differently and formed a completely new outcome. The term that's been floating around lately thanks to a highly anticipated film that fell so flat on its face, it created a whole new subgenre, the Multiverse of Madness. Okay. Credit where credit's due. The movie wasn't terrible. It was actually really entertaining. But its biggest sin was the major fact that, well, there was no madness to the multiverse. That's where the jokes stem from. Watch Spiderman No Way Home? People often say it's the real Multiverse of Madness. Played Bayonetta 3? That's the real Multiverse of Madness too. Everything Everywhere All at Once? Okay, yeah, we can all agree, that's the true king of Multiverse of Madness. Yeah. Doctor Strange 2's subtitle has become a meme. This was supposed to be Marvel's first deep dive into its multiverse concept, so they really needed to impress. I'll be the first to admit, the lack of madness in the multiverse isn't the only flaw this film has either. It completely shit the bed with plot holes, unbelievable character motives, and completely broken power scaling. All these factors mixed together has revitalized an argument from fans that perhaps a multiverse setting really is a sign that a franchise is all out of ideas. And while Marvel's extremely hyped multiverse movie certainly gives weight to that argument, I'd argue that it's just not true. Does a multiverse really have to be the end-all be-all of a franchise? Or do these movies, and games, and TV shows just keep getting it wrong? Let's look at the best and worst aspects of these multiverse stories and analyze the perfect way to handle it. Roll the intro. Okay, what's the point? Why use a multiverse as your setting at all? Well, sometimes, to get a point across, the idea of infinite possibilities can be an extremely effective tool. You can use the multiverse to emphasize an important theme or lesson. Like, let's say a film wants to say that humanity will always destroy itself. You can make a multiverse piece to show even with infinite timelines, humanity always finds a way to kill itself off. Or you could do the opposite. In every timeline, humanity perseveres and brings itself back up from the brink of destruction. These are some extreme examples, of course, but you get the picture. So, with that being said, your movie that's supposed to touch on the concept of infinite possibilities better show infinite possibilities. This is the first thing a multiverse story should aim to achieve. Our poster child, Multiverse of Madness, is a great example of how not to handle this concept. It makes sure to reference infinite possibilities, but it never actually makes them a meaningful part of the film. Like this scene here. America Chavez usually talks about fundamental differences like worlds that don't have currency for essentials like food. This would, in any other work, be an important topic of discussion that could actually be used to give the film some kind of purpose. Why yes, it is ridiculous that we have to pay for food and shelter, the most pivotal things a human needs to survive. Why don't we change that? Well, Multiverse of Madness doesn't care, nor does it offer solutions. Matter of fact, Doctor Strange just shrugs the entire concept off because, according to the film, this line is nothing more than a joke. Human suffering is nothing more than a joke. Worlds where this entire problem is solved are nothing more than a joke, and are just one possibility out of an infinite number. Then we have a rather cool segment later on where Doctor Strange and America get tossed through a bunch of different universes. It's glorious to behold visually, and yes, it shows us how far multiversal possibilities can go, such as a world made entirely of paint, but these crazy ideas are literally locked into this one segment. The entire thing is about 40 seconds long in a 2-hour, 6-minute long movie. There you go. That's your Multiverse of Madness, just this one scene. By comparison, Everything Everywhere All at Once achieves an exploration of endless universes to a shocking degree, especially for a movie with such a mundane setting. In this film, Evelyn Wong is an old-fashioned mother who runs a laundromat with her husband. She's not even the type of person movies are made about anymore. She's clearly archaic in her ways. She's unaccepting of her daughter being LGBT, and her biggest desires are to get a divorce and please her family. Those two things are not necessarily synonymous. Anyways, she's a bigoted, rude, conservative woman whom the audience clearly won't like, and it takes an entire multiversal journey to change her mind about the people around her. To progress past her stagnation, she journeys through a world where she was a badass assassin, a world where she's a successful star, a world where she herself is homosexual and everyone has spaghetti for hands too, because why not? Even a world where she's a literal rock. This is just a small touch of the kinds of worlds Evelyn has to see, but I'm assuming you get the picture by now. Everything Everywhere All at Once shows that possibilities in the multiverse are truly endless, and there's no bounds when it comes to what differences there may be. All of this is to tie into another thing that a multiverse film can do. Serve a purpose with its multiverse, like I talked about before. Where Doctor Strange 2 literally begs you to turn your brain off while watching and uses important concepts as jokes, Everything Everywhere All at Once uses a multiverse to showcase meaningful interactions for Evelyn. Seeing the people closest to her cast into endless scenarios changes not only her perception of them and herself, but her entire worldview. What in this existence truly matters? What doesn't? Does it really matter that my daughter has an affinity for women? Are my family's judgments on others really that important? Are my husband and I really worth so little just because we live and work in a laundromat? If I don't get this loan, am I really worth nothing? Or is it the decisions we make every day? How we choose to treat the people around us? How they feel about themselves and if they're cared for enough? Is that what actually matters? There's a whole slew of lessons to be learned here, and Everything Everywhere All at Once makes sure to spend time tackling each one. According to good old Mom, though, that's all just a joke. Again, I cite the brief line about monetizing necessities. If you're going to write a multiverse and introduce a worthwhile concept, it can actually go a long way in giving your story purpose if you explore it. Use those infinite possibilities to your advantage. Look Both Ways isn't typically the kind of movie you think of when you think of a multiverse film, but it deals with two alternate universes that branch out at a pivotal moment in one woman's life. Natalie is a promising animation student who dreams of moving to LA so she can work at her ideal studio with her ideal boss and become the professional she always wanted to be. She has a 5-year plan that she absolutely does not want to break no matter what. However, the story branches dramatically when one timeline sees Natalie becoming pregnant, while the other sees her merely getting sick from convenience store sushi. Both paths take Natalie through a roller coaster of emotions to achieve her dream, and both realities force her to break her 5-year plan. However, the climax for each scenario gives a similar ending. While I won't spoil what the end is, the movie is still about the journey more than anything, and similarly to Everything Everywhere All at Once, this meaningful use of a multiverse is a major strong point for Look Both Ways. The message was that there is no one way to reach a destination. There's no singular version of that destination. Life can be what you make it, so we should always do our very best. Be our very best version of ourselves and aim for what we want. There will be obstacles, but we can always try to overcome them. Now, up until now, it may sound like I'm just shitting on Doctor Strange 2 for being the only multiverse works that does things wrong, but actually there are plenty of other multiverse plots that screw up. Bayonetta 3 is a good example of a story that shouldn't have had a multiverse at all. Bayonetta 1 and 2 did a great job of having a multiverse because they kept it in the background, allowing us to focus on the main timeline. They showed several key circumstances where Bayonetta accidentally created new timelines by interfering with the past, yet still focused on one universe. This allowed us to care about the characters and their struggles, since they were still at the forefront. Bayonetta 3 chose to focus on a version of Bayonetta that was created from the events of Bayonetta 1. This alone was a really cool premise, and held lots of promise, but issues start to arise when we travel to different universes, and the only differences are really the locations Bayonetta ends up living in. One sees her move to Tokyo, another sees her leading a medieval-style world in China. There's one where she grew up as the Princess of Egypt, and finally we see a world where her mother never died and the two became thieves in France. While these differences aren't necessarily boring, it is a shame that they're all we got to see. With how much the multiverse and Bayonetta must have spiraled to infinite levels, it would have been awesome to see something wildly different, like a world where Bayonetta was born as a man, becoming a sage instead of a witch. Heck, that could have been the main villain. Instead though, we see Bayonetta travel what feels more like around the world than to different universes. And she hardly interacts with any of her counterparts or characters from these worlds as they die almost immediately when crossing paths. That means Bayonetta 3 didn't need to be a multiverse at all. Wouldn't it have been simpler and more effective to have these counterparts just be different heroes from around the world that Bayonetta fails to save because they couldn't save themselves? Maybe even tie a lesson to each death? In the entirety of Bayonetta 3, Cereza doesn't grow at all. She finds out she became a mother in another timeline, but she doesn't change from this. She sees herself and her friends dying in other worlds, but her actions remain the same. Perhaps if the developers hadn't tried to shoehorn in a multiverse story, then they could have focused more on how saving the world would make Bayonetta grow as a character. Or perhaps they would have used something like a male counterpart being the villain to showcase some sort of emotional struggle within her that she needed to overcome. Ultimately, she's stuck with a rather shallow and needless multiverse plot that adds nothing to the spectacle or the story in a worthwhile way. There was one aspect I glossed over that Bayonetta did right though. It's something that many other works have done a great job at implementing as well, and that's showing the conception of your multiverse. We'll look at a few examples. Let's start with the Bayonetta series though. In Bayonetta 1, Bayonetta takes Cereza back to her timeline after sharing an intimate journey filled with lessons about standing up for yourself, caring for others, and protecting what you care about most. Because Cereza learned these lessons early on in her childhood, she grew up to make a life-changing choice to fight back during the witch hunts instead of being sealed away for 500 years, leading her to become the most powerful version of herself in the multiverse, as we eventually see in Bayonetta 3. You can even write your multiverse story to focus its plot entirely on the conception. A great example of this actually does come from the MCU. Of course, it's not Multiverse of Madness. Loki is a show about, you guessed it, Loki. This version of him comes from the time around the first Avengers movie, meaning he hasn't experienced anything beyond that. He's ripped out of time by a strange police force known as the TVA for breaking some sort of multiversal law, and since he's the god of mischief, it turns out his variants do this pretty often. This particular Loki, though, ends up going on a journey with the Time Patrol that captured him after he sees how insignificant one timeline is compared to the power and scale of this multiversal operation. Those who work for the TVA are known as timekeepers, and it's their job to ensure a limited multiverse exists, one that follows a similar path, as this is what they call their sacred timeline. Every MCU work we had seen up until Loki took place within the sacred timeline. However, the events of Loki actually show the creation of the much more diverse multiverse that we see in all the films to follow, such as What If?, Spiderman No Way Home, and everyone's favorite, Multiverse of Madness. Sorry, I couldn't keep a straight face for that one. Since the Timekeepers exist outside of time, you could argue that the multiverse always has and always will exist to an infinite degree, which also explains why the Defenders saga, the X-Men films, and even the older Spider-Man movies are now officially canon in the MCU. Funny enough, Loki, even existing in the same extended universe as Doctor Strange 2, actually did an amazing job at showcasing endless possibilities and creating meaning with its use of the multiverse. Figured I'd just add that for extra shame on good old mom. But your story can also revolve around trying to pin down exactly when the conception of the multiverse occurs, if one occurs at all, and playing with the audience's perception to make that journey interesting. In Dark, a small town is shaken to its core when awful things begin happening to the residents. Now, it sounds pretty run-of-the-mill. The first 2 episodes play out like your standard mystery suspense, making the viewer believe that the show might just be a tad bit overdramatic for what seems like standard fare for the genre. But eventually plot twists are revealed that completely shift your perspective on what you've been seeing up to that point. The complex ways everything is connected and what's actually happening and why, these are the crux that Dark is built on. The plot you thought you knew is only half the story at every given plot twist. If what I'm saying sounds vague, that's on purpose. This is a story that may or may not include a multiverse of sorts. Does it? Does it not? That's part of the storytelling. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, honestly, it's to go watch Dark. No, I mean really, it might be the best show ever made. And each season ranks either at or right below 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. So if you don't take my word for it, take theirs. This show will liquefy your mind. But finally, for your Multiverse of Madness to be effective, you need, well, madness. Everything Everywhere All at Once toys with elements of not only wacky action, but also psychology to make us feel like this ride is a mad ride. For all its storytelling faults, Bayonetta 3 has crazy amounts of madness that make up for its shortcomings. You'd be hard-pressed to find spectacle or gameplay like this elsewhere, especially executed this well. Spider-Man No Way Home offers plenty of delicious jokes for the Spideys to constantly bounce off one another, but the real madness comes from the sheer amount of iconic villains tossed in the fray at once. What If has some wild scenarios, culminating in an epic multiversal crossover against a truly multiversal threat. Multiverse of Madness had a 40-second segment and I guess one well-choreographed fight. Okay. Where was the madness? If you ask me, labeling your movie Multiverse of Madness really entails you at least know how to nail the madness part. For Doctor Strange 2, that's not even close to the case. The Scarlet Witch breaks Marvel's power scaling entirely, and she's scary because of it, yeah, but she's not acting as a multiversal threat. The movie was about her trying to get the power to travel the multiverse to take care of some kids that already have a version of her as their guardian. Like, okay. We can easily compare her to Jobu Tupaki from Everything Everywhere All at Once. Both characters can travel the multiverse by taking over variants of themselves. Both have endless supplies of magic, and both break the power scale because they're both literally supposed to be able to do anything they want with their magic. So why did Jobu Tupaki seem like such a larger threat by comparison? Even though Multiverse of Madness goes as far out of its way as possible to pretend Wandavision never happened, it still does humanize Wanda to an extent. She's not needlessly killing, especially at first. She only kills those who she gives several warnings to, and they still defy her by attacking. Which makes it kind of hard to take any of their deaths seriously, since they all literally could just have talked things out instead of trying to fight. Meanwhile, Jobu Tupaki treats murder as meaningless, and sometimes even as a game. This makes her a million times more terrifying already, because it seems there's also no reasoning with her. There's no correct option to save yourself. As I mentioned, the abilities of these two powerhouses are also extremely similar. Since Multiverse of Madness just gives Wanda whatever power or ability she needs at any given moment, it's safe to say she's capable of anything. So why then does she constantly not do those things? She can fly, but she chases Doctor Strange on foot, even after cutting her feet on glass. She can change the molecular structure of anything around her without moving an inch. So why do we see her bothering to fight with force instead, when it doesn't even do what she needs? She has stronger mental powers than Professor X, yet she doesn't use this a single time when trying to convince anyone that her motives are righteous. This takes Wanda from being a scary villain to being a joke. Meanwhile, Jobu Tupaki does change the molecular structure of everything around her, constantly, throughout most scenes she's in. She can even create things out of nothing, something Wanda was shown to be capable of in Wandavision, yet not explored any further in Doctor Strange 2. Jobu also uses her power of timeline jumping in much cleverer ways, such as using it as a spying tool, as much as she uses it to kill. This makes Jobu unpredictable, in a way that's threatening, not funny. Matter of fact, she's only funny when she wants to be, like when she's messing around with her prey. She is the definition of a loose cannon. Let's also compare Wanda to another multiversal villain. This one also being from the MCU. What If's Ultron. What If had a multiverse scenario that really felt like the multiverse was not only at stake, but mad. Ultron grew so powerful in one timeline that he was able to travel out to erase the others and even see the Watcher, a being who seemed to only exist as a liaison between us, the audience, and the show that we're watching. This was creative, fun, and scary at the same time. The audience can even feel threatened themselves at this point because the meta nature of Ultron's ability to sense the Watcher. It took a variant of Doctor Strange that, through a super interesting backstory, gained a similar level of power to also sense the Watcher, to rally alongside some other character variants whose backstories were also explored in earlier episodes, and team up to defeat Ultron under the guidance of the Watcher himself. If that summary felt loaded as heck, I guess that means the show got the madness part right, am I right? This feeling of setup and culmination, meta character interactions, and sheer exploration of multiverse concepts leads to a much more satisfying adventure than what we got in good old Mom. Wanda should have been on the same level as Ultron from What If. Doctor Strange should have needed a power-up like the variant in the show. Some sort of liaison between us and the universes needed to be established. Better. But, again, as much as it sounds like it, this video isn't a critique on Doctor Strange 2. It's more so an extended way to tell you guys that a multiverse does not need to be the be-all end-all for a series or franchise. It just needs to be done right. I've seen so many people say that a multiverse is always the final frontier for a series when it's lost all of its ideas. But we've journeyed through examples of how a multiverse can just be another tool to get a point across. An epic and fun way to teach important lessons. But don't just take it from me. I want to hear from you. I'm sure you guys have plenty of movies, shows, and games floating around in your heads right now, so go ahead and comment them below so that we can keep this conversation going. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon for making videos like this possible. I couldn't make these lengthy works without you. If you'd like to also become a patron, the link is right there in front of you right now. Otherwise, feel free to continue watching more of my videos that I also have linked here.